Hi, welcome back. This is the first lecture on substantial issues in the course. Obviously, it's literature and culture, well, of the third world, China, is the name of the course. This lecture will be some general principles, some general background that we'll be using over the course of the semester, and that will uh, lead into the discussion of Confucianism or Rushui. Oh, there we go. First, I want to mention a handful of course themes. Just it partially recapitulates things I've said already, but I think it's worth going through nonetheless. One of the things we'll be focusing on is the set of culturally specific systems of thought, imagination, and feeling, as I call them. These are principally philosophical uh, philosophical systems or philosophical approaches to ethics and politics and social relations. Um, though we will also touch on their relation to aesthetics to some extent. Um, Culture specific means that they're particular to China. Um, Again, my background, my bachelor's and master's degrees are in philosophy, though my PhD is in English. Uh, and although, again, the PhD is principally in literary theory. So I'm particularly interested in philosophical issues, and so we'll be addressing the literature in relation to this philosophical context. As I mentioned in the first sub bullet point, there are three main traditional teachings or schools or families. Sunja is what the phrase is. Sun is three. And Ja is a school or a tradition. In more ordinary language, more ordinary usage, it's a family. Um, and so these three traditional schools or teachings or whatever are called Ru Shui or Ru Jia, Dao Jia, and Buddhism. Ru Shui or Ru Jia is usually referred to as Confucianism in the West. It's the teachings uh, largely associated with Kongzi, or Confucius, but not confined to him. Um, the Ru, again, are the literati, the educated class. Dao Da is generally referred to as Taoism. Tao means the way. We'll talk about that subsequently. It's another prominent uh, system of thought, sort of way of being in the world. It sort of presents a philosophy of life, as does Ru Shui. Both Ru Shui and Dao Shui or Dao Jia are arose within China. Buddhism developed in what is now India or South Asia more generally, and was taken up in China. The fact that it doesn't have a Chinese origin um, was an actual point of controversy about its adoption in China, and it led to its suppression at some times, at some periods. But it has been similarly influential and important as Ru and Dao Shui. Um, these aren't the only schools. We'll also touch on what's called Moism, uh, the teachings of Mozi, legalism, another influential school of thought in China, historically in China. There are also different schools of Rushui that are very diverse. Different schools of Buddhism. There are different aspects of Taoism, the sort of philosophical and the practical Taoism are really very different. One thing that I want to note as background for these different schools of thought is that they needn't be mutually exclusive for ordinary people in China. Now, some things are mutually exclusive. It would be hard to be a follower of the Rushui school of Mengzi, which we'll be talking about later. It would be hard to be a follower of that and also a follower of legalism. Those alternatives seem to me to be pretty much mutually exclusive. But you can be a follower of Kongzi, and all in certain contexts, when you have to do rituals, when you have to engage in formal meetings with people, when you have to decide how to behave toward parents or siblings or whatever, and a follower of Taoism in other contexts, and a follower of Buddhism in other contexts, and this is historically quite common in China. It's quite common for people to adopt different schools of thought and different philosophies of life in different aspects of their lives, combining especially Rushui, Dao Shui, and Buddhism. Okay. Second point. First, we're going to be looking at some culturally specific systems of thought. We'll also, to some extent, although less so, look at historical developments. So how given events or given ideas or given literary practices are historically embedded. There are two ways or two things that I want to bring up about this to emphasize now. One is that we'll often see patterns across periods. For example, there's a recurring pattern in Chinese history of growing polarization of wealth distribution, growing discrepancies between the rich and the poor, growing pauperization of ordinary people, government stepping in, instituting land redistribution, engaging in some sort of government ownership of commodities, government control of trade or whatever, in order to try to rectify the situation which is causing suffering to the impoverished masses. This is also often connected with popular movements, sometimes on a number of occasions, revolutionary movements. And you see this extending to the modern period. Indeed, when I say this, probably what you would think of as the communist revolution in the 20th century, but there are precursors to that. In part, the patterns are the sorts of things that would arise on their own due to the nature of cultural practices and political structure and so on. But in part, it's also a matter of self-conscious modeling. In other words, people know what has been done in their country in the past, and they look to the past for models for how to evaluate and how to evaluate the present and how to challenge and change those aspects of the present they object to. The second sub-bullet point under historical embedment, I mentioned a number of things that are recurrent, sort of alternatives, oppositions that are recurrent across Chinese history. There are often waves of xenophobia, fear of foreign culture, but there are also waves of embrace of foreign culture, which is then what's called sinicized. Sinicization is the process of taking some non-Chinese practice or idea or philosophy, such as Buddhism, or in the 20th century Marxism, and reshaping them so that they are more congruent with Chinese cultural practices. And you find both sinicization and xenophobia with respect to Buddhism. For example, Buddhism enters from India, from South Asia. It's embraced, altered, sinicized. It's combined with Ru Shui, for example. To take an instance, a central precept of Ru Shui is filial piety, devotion to one's parents, and deference to them and service to them and so on. It's called Shao. We'll talk about that later. That is not a central idea in traditional Indian Buddhism, but it gets introduced into Buddhist texts in sometimes important ways in China. That would be a simple example of sinicization. And then the suppression of Buddhist monasteries, for example, often is associated with waves of xenophobia in China. Politically, there are recurring patterns of growing authoritarianism and rigid political hierarchy, but also mass rebellion that can lead and has led in some famous cases to the establishment of a new ruling dynasty drawn from the popular classes, or from the ordinary people. I've already mentioned wealth concentration versus some sort of social or later literally socialist concerns and wealth distribution. So these are sort of dynamic cultural and political dynamics that recur historically in China and that will also shape some of what we'll be talking about. So some of what we'll be talking about are the ways in which different literary works relate to philosophies of life, especially the main systems of thought that I mentioned, Ru Shui, Dao Shui, and Buddhism. But also we'll pay less attention, but some attention to historical embedment in some of these recurring patterns and features. Just to elaborate on sinicization a bit, again, not only Buddhism, but the introduction of Marxism in 20th century China, the development of Maoism, post-Mao, what the Chinese Communist Party refers to as communism with Chinese characteristics. These are all some perhaps more familiar examples of sinicization. We'll also be concerned to some, at least in certain cases, with individual appropriations. In other words, what individual artists, which is to say authors, do with the work that they take over. So Gao, one of the last author will be a contemporary Nobel laureate that we'll be discussing, a playwright, draws on theater of the absurd and Western postmodernist literary trends more generally. And he, in part, synthesizes them by integrating them with Buddhism, although, frankly, Buddhism by that point had already so greatly influenced Western traditions that incorporating Buddhism hardly counts as synthesization. But there is a degree of synthesization. But in addition, and perhaps more importantly, Gao has his own particular attitudes, his own particular ideas and responses and so on that he develops in his plays. This isn't confined to the modern period. Guan Hanqing, the great Yuan dramatist, also individually appropriates ideas. He has his own individual voice as well. So those are some of the last thing I wanted to mention is that organizing a lot of what I'll be doing is the presumption that there's a range of cross-cultural possibilities and tendencies that are just human. This is why, and cultural traditions aren't like vastly different, unrelated developments that brook no comparison or have no connections. In fact, what cultural traditions are, in my view, are specifications of universal cross-cultural, transhistorical, cross-cultural human possibilities and tendencies. So out of all of the different ways we can be human, different cultures emphasize some aspects and develop some aspects in ways that are not emphasized or developed as thoroughly or in as much detail in other cultures. So there are certainly differences, but the differences are all derivative from basic human capacities. And that's why it makes sense for us to study other cultures. It's why we can learn from and appreciate other cultures. It's because they simply enrich our human possibilities. So, and there, of course, also the same point applies to the the individual particularization of these tendencies, whether by Gao or Guan Hanqing or whomever. Okay. Some general points about history and culture. I'm going to skip over the maps. By the time you're seeing this, the PowerPoint itself will be uploaded. All you have to do is click on the links for the maps, and if you want to see some maps of of China, I think it's a good thing to do to get a visual association with China as it is now, and to get some connections with how the extent of of Chinese territory changed over the course of the centuries. So I have links to maps connected with some of the different dynasties, but I probably won't be looking at those. Okay. It's a commonplace that the history of China is very autocratic. But as I've already mentioned, it is autocratic. There is certainly that element to the history of the governing system, the imperial the imperial rule of dynasties over millennia. I certainly don't want to deny that, but I want you to keep in mind that this is continually challenged. There are frequent peasant rebellions. There are demands for and practices of land distribution. The well field system, as it's called, is an ancient system of redividing the land that is partially individually owned and partially collectively owned. There are traditions of government ownership of key commodities such as iron, salt, and alcohol, so that the communist practices we see, for example, the communist practices we see in China in the 20th century are not anomalous in the history of China. They have precedents. And indeed, the conflicting aspects of Communist Party rule in China have different precedents in the history of China. And the reason I'm pressing this is that I want you to have a sense of the diversity and dynamism of China. This is, of course, not confined to China. It's true of every place is diverse and dynamic. But this course is on China, and so I don't want you to come away with the idea that China is one thing. It's lots of different things, and they're continually challenging and conflicting and changing one another. I give a little subnote here. One thing that is perhaps interesting, I find it interesting, is that the peasant rebellions are often associated with millenarianism. In other words, they're often linked with religious movements that see the time being ripe for a total transformation of society and perhaps of the entire world, often dictated by heaven, Tian. Tian is the word for heaven. We'll get to the concept of heaven later on. Okay. Again, on the ruling structure, you do have an emperor, but you have, for much of the history of China, you have a large bureaucracy, often of literati, of highly educated people who went through an examination system. We'll talk about, this wasn't instituted from the beginning. It was instituted well after. The education system was based on Ru Shui, Confucianism, but it was not instituted for a long time after Kongzi, Confucius. But as I say, we'll talk about it, but it's important to recognize that this counterbalanced the autocratic power of the emperor, as did some other aspects of Chinese society. Another range of diversity is in languages. There are many languages spoken in China. They aren't just dialects, even though you'll hear them referred to as dialects. That's wrong. That makes it sound like it's the difference between Putonghua, what's called Mandarin in English, and Cantonese. It makes it sound like that difference is like the difference between British English and American English, or something like that. But no, it's not. It's like the difference between Spanish and Italian or something. They're different languages. This map shows you some of the different languages and different language families. Even Mandarin has different versions that are not necessarily mutually comprehensible. though you can see Mandarin is pretty well distributed in this mustard-colored region. Okay. Oh. So we're not going to be talking about different languages, but I want you to be aware of that difference, that diversity in China. The most common language is Putonghua, referred to as Mandarin. Basically, I'll be treating the Chinese that we look at as if it were Putonghua, although that's somewhat inaccurate, just as it would be inaccurate to treat Middle English as if it were contemporary American English. There are differences, and sometimes those will be significant. One thing that's important to note, if you're not aware of it, is that while in English we use different pitch levels and changes in pitch for semantic purposes, we do so only at what's sometimes referred to as the discourse level. So in other words, in order to indicate that something is a sentence, for example, is a question, for example, we might use a change in pitch contour. So you're going to the store is an assertion. You're going to the store is a question. And the question, I mean, obviously we can also indicate a question in English by lexical means, by syntactic and lexical means, by saying, are you going to the store? But in the example I just gave, you're going to the store. We indicate the question by the change in pitch contour. But that's basically the only way we use pitch semantically in English. In Chinese and in a number of other languages, tones are used, pitch level and pitch contour. Pitch contour just means changes in pitch, are used to distinguish different word meanings. So they're what's called phonemic. They make the same sort of difference in a word as two different consonants or vowels would. So that, to give an example, first I wanted to tell you what the different, I skipped over in Mandarin, there's a high tone, a level tone, a descending tone, an ascending tone, and a sort of scooping tone, a descent and ascent. So, for example, pu or zi is the scooping tone in pu tong hua. Tong is the high level tone, and hua is the descending tone. Those aren't the only tones you can have. In fact, in Cantonese, there are more, for example. Now, we're obviously not going to be doing anything with tones per se, or almost nothing. But it's important to know of their existence because they often have a significant function in poetry. In addition, you'll be looking at some words, some Chinese words, when you're looking at poetry. And it's important to recognize that two words that have the same letters but don't have the same diacritical marks are not the same word. So the diacritical marks, as you can see, is my cursor, yeah. You can see here the scooping tone is marked by that caret there, the high level tone by that macron, and the hua by that sloping accent. Again, pu, pong, hua. In poetry, the use of tones is often used musically. They're gathered into two groups. They aren't. You don't pay attention to all the tones separately, but they can be in different sorts of poetry. The use of tones is regulated and part of the musicality of the verse in the same way that stress patterns are used in English verse, as in iambic pentameter. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, to take a famous sonnet by Shakespeare. Those are all iambs, which is to say, sequences of unstressed and stressed syllables. They go unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress. So you have 10 syllables alternating unstressed and stressed, and that's part of the musicality of the sonnet. Tones can be regulated, patterned in that way in Chinese poetry, and often are, and that's part of the quality of the poetry, the value of the poetry. You're also going to be looking at some things in the writing system, so I want to mention some aspects of the writing system so that you're familiar with that too. As you've seen, China does not use an alphabetic system. It uses a sort of ideographic system. Specifically, the writing system, there are typically two components. As I say, 85% of the symbols, the characters as they're called, the symbols for words, 85% of them have two components. One is a semantic classifier. It tells you the type of meaning you're supposed to be, that this character communicates. And the other is a phonetic indicator, which tells you, gives you not the exact sound necessarily, but indicates what sort of sound the character represents. So there's in effect two sort of clues as to what the character means. So here's a good example of the writing system, and also a good example of the way in which a difference in tone is phonemic in the linguistic sense. It constitutes a difference in the two words themselves. So the word ma means horse, whereas the word ma means mother. The character for horse, the first one, does not include the two components I mentioned. It's a sort of core or basic character. It developed out of a kind of picture of a horse, a very stylized picture of a horse. In effect, you had that square with four little lines coming down from the square representing the four legs of the horse. And if you use your imagination and sort of fill in 4 lines there instead of the 2, um, you can maybe get an idea of how the character initially was sort of a pictographic representation of a horse. The second character, however, does have the 2 components. The first component is the symbol nu, or woman or female, and that is the semantic classifier. The second is ma. As you see, you can plainly see that this part of the character here is the same as that. So basically what the conjunction of those 2 parts of the character tells you is that this character represents a female, the word for which sounds like ma. And so, of course, the female, the word for which sounds like ma is ma, mother. Again, this is, I want you to have this background to have some familiarity here, because we will be looking in connection with the poetry. I'll be asking you to look at some Chinese. Now, by the way, don't get frightened by that. In fact, one of the reasons I want to do this is to want to make sure to, especially with electronic aids, one of the things I want to do is show you how easy this is to do, how it's not something to be afraid of, and how you can actually get access, a more nuanced access to the Chinese language itself, as I say, especially with the electronic aids available through internet connections and so on. But you need to know something about the writing system and the language, and aspects of the language that are very different from English, principally the use of tones. You need to know something about that to really make anything out, to be able to make any headway in checking aspects of the Chinese language itself. I believe being able to do that greatly enriches the literature. Your response to the literature, because the literature itself is enriched by adding this other sort of semi-pictographic layer of representation. I mean, basically in, say, English poetry, it doesn't really matter. The poets don't really make use, or there isn't any obvious way of making use of what letters of the alphabet you use. But you can add subtlety and a range of implications and ideas to a Chinese poem through the level of patterning in the characters, which is not reducible to the level of patterning in the words and the concepts that the words represent. It adds to that. Of course, one so it's a very poetically rich system of writing, but one problem is that it's hugely complex and very hard to learn. That's why you have the rise of literati, in part because of this extremely complicated writing system. You don't have to learn just 20-something letters and have a sense of places in which they have unusual pronunciation, as in English. You have to learn lots and lots and lots. Almost as many symbols as you learn words. And so this is just a huge task. And hence the rise of the literati, also called shi, or again, ru, as in rouge shui. Slingerhand explains the Ru as a class of specialists concerned with transmitting and preserving the traditional rituals and texts of the Zhou dynasty. And we'll turn to the Zhou dynasty very soon. Again, the Ru, this class of literati, the specialists in traditional rituals and texts, they give their name to Ru Shui, what we call Confucianism. I should also mention that there's a difference between the traditional writing system and the simplified writing system. The traditional system was used until the middle of the 20th century, when the Communist Party of China introduced the simplified system. Since then, the Communist Party of China has generally used the simplified People's Republic of China, has generally used the simplified system. Taiwan has continued to use the traditional system, and of course anything printed in Chinese anywhere before the middle of the 20th century is in the traditional system. The traditional system is more complicated. It has the slight advantage that in some cases it may give you more of a hint as to what the original pictogram looked like for those characters that, such as Ma, that have that, but it's, to my mind, not much of an advantage. I personally, of course, the simplified version is what to the extent that I've learned Chinese characters, which is extremely limited, but to the extent that I have learned any, I've learned them in the simplified system. So of course I'm prejudiced in favor of the simplified system, but I do believe that it makes sense to simplify it. The traditional system seems to me needlessly complex. I should also mention that there are two primary systems of phonetic transcription of Chinese. One is the Wade-Giles system. The other is what's called pinyin. Pinyin is the system used by the People's Republic of China, again designed in the middle 20th century and advocated by the Chinese Communist Party. I find the pinyin system much more intuitive, and it's the system that I will in general use. But you should know that the systems are rather different, and the pronunciation in the Wade-Giles system again is different from the pronunciation in the pinyin system. So for example, in the pinyin system, Dao is spelled D-A-O. The letters are D-A-O. And then, of course, it has the diacritic mark, too. In the Wade-Giles system, it's spelled T-A-O. But you pronounce it kind of weirdly as Dao, as a D. That initial T you pronounce as a D, even in the Wade-Giles system. The way the Wade-Giles system marks a T as opposed to a D is it writes T apostrophe. So T apostrophe A-O would be pronounced Tao, and T-A-O is pronounced Dao. In contrast, in the pinyin system, D-A-O is the way you write Dao, and if you wrote T-A-O, that would be pronounced Tao. Or as in Shin, the word for heart or mind, is represented by the letter X in pinyin. It's represented by the letters HS in Wade-Giles. So if you see the word HSIN in, say, something from the printed in 1920, and then you see something printed in 1970 that has XIN. They're both pronounced Shin, and they both mean heart-mind. It's the same word, just in the two systems. So you should know that there are these systems. Again, I'll be using pinyin, but that doesn't mean all the texts you look at or come across will be using pinyin. They won't. Okay. Why is it not doing anything? Oh, why does it do this? There we go. The next thing I want to turn to is Chinese history. Frankly, I don't think very historically, and so I'm not going to emphasize history in the course. But it is important to have some sense of the huge history of China. And basically, I'll tell you the things that, for purposes of our course, I think it's important you know about. Please feel free to read more about Chinese history on your own, learning more about this fascinating, the fascinating developments and complexities of social, political, economic development in that region. So, come on. Oh, maps. Yeah. So the first thing to mention, you should be aware that there is the earliest. Oh, actually, something I forgot to mention. I'm going to be particularly concerned with what you might call received history, or the uses of history, or the way an understanding of history operates to guide thought, action, feeling for Chinese writers. So my concern isn't that of an historian. I'm not going to be attending to, I won't be, as far as I know, I won't be telling you stuff that's wrong. But I'm not going to be concerned with getting a fine-grained understanding of precisely what really happened in the past. I'm more concerned with what's sometimes called the usable past, what people have taken the past to mean and how they've used it. And so this enters particularly with the very beginnings of Chinese history as it is traditionally imagined. The earliest Chinese history is folklorically associated with a series of legendary emperors, crucially Huangdi. The Yellow Emperor, Huang, just means yellow. The Yellow Emperor, a lionized figure, a revered figure who is said to have, as I note here, said to have invented writing, ceramics, the calendar. He is a sort of culture founder in the in Chinese popular imagination and elite imagination for millennia. So you'll often see him invoked, since China with its traditions since Huangdi or whatever. He is seen as having given China some of the things that made it distinctive from early on. Its elaborate and highly valued writing system, its art, its very functional art of ceramics, pottery making, and so on, its calendar, its way of understanding the passage of time and organizing it, etc. There are also a series of sage kings, kings who are invoked again, folklorically, for their wisdom, for the ethical lessons that they taught, for the political excellence, the selfless devotion to the society that they are supposed to manifest, their knowledge and understanding of politics and society. Yao, Shun, Yu. These are all names that you come across. I mean, you in the history of Chinese literature, you'll read comparisons like, not since the time of Yao has such an excellent emperor, or whatever. Not since Shun and Yu have we seen such devotion to the people, or whatever. So these are figures that have extreme cultural importance. And I mean, understanding them is like understanding, well, not understanding them, but just knowing of how they're used is like understanding the place of George Washington in American folklore. The stories of how he couldn't tell a lie or whatever. Pre-imperial dynasties, real dynasties, there are two that are sort of the initial historical dynasties, the Xia and the Shang. I won't be saying anything about them except to note that the Shang are generally seen to have, or generally believed to have, declined in their excellence. They became less and less devoted to the people, less and less wise, less and less benevolent. And more generally, they drifted from the way, the Tao, the way that they were supposed to behave, the way that they were supposed to act, as mandated, as delivered, as determined by the eternal principles of heaven, Tian, Tian. So they drifted from the Tian Dao, the way of heaven. And it's a principle, it's like a central commonplace of Chinese political thought that a dynasty is underwritten by what's called Tianming, the mandate of heaven. Heaven, it's sort of like the divine right of kings in the West. Heaven, in effect, selects the ruling dynasty. And in selecting the ruling dynasty, it awards that dynasty its mandate to rule. But if the ruling dynasty drifts from the proper path, it doesn't follow the principles set forth by heaven. If it doesn't follow the Tian Dao, it will lose the mandate of heaven, and that mandate of heaven will be transferred to another dynasty. And so folklorically and indeed philosophically, the crucial transition here was from the Shang to the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty, in its origins, is considered historically, is received as, in Chinese tradition, is received as the exemplary dynasty, at least in its beginnings. Specifically, again, the last Shang ruler lost the Tianming, the mandate of heaven. A local ruler, King Wen, refused to rebel against the last Shang ruler, showing his deference, his piety, and thus his conformity to the general principles of respect for authority that were thought to be part of the principles set forth by Tian, by heaven. His son, King Wu, did rebel because he recognized that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven by not following the right principles. And he rebelled and established the Zhou dynasty, but he didn't establish it for himself. He named his father the first ruler of the Zhou dynasty. So that's again, in Chinese tradition, that again is considered exemplary behavior on King Wu's part. When the next change in ruler came, the heir apparent was underage, and his uncle, the Duke of Zhou, served as regent. And the story goes that there was concern that the Duke of Zhou would simply usurp power for himself. But as soon as his ward, the heir apparent, came of age, the Duke of Zhou resigned. So here again, we have an exemplary case of behaving in the right moral way. So King Wen, King Wu, and the Duke of Zhou, these three early figures in the Zhou dynasty, are considered paradigms of following the Tiandao, the way of heaven, for their moral devotion. And you'll see when you read Kongzi, again, Kongzi is Confucius, you'll see that he invokes these three figures as exemplars, as perfect examples of following the Tao, the Tiandao. Once the Zhou dynasty declined, and this took about 800 years, what's called the Spring and Autumn period began. This was a period of disunity and warfare, during the Spring and Autumn period and the period following the Spring and Autumn period, there was considerable nostalgia for the stability, the peace, and prosperity of the Zhou dynasty. And this figures prominently in Kongzi's Lunyu, his Analects, the conversations recorded in the little snippets of conversation recorded in the primary text, one of the founding texts, the primary text of Kongzi, and one of the founding texts of Rushui. This movement from stability and peace to instability and warfare is widely seen, I think quite correctly, as having inspired Kongzi in his thoughts about how people should behave and how societies should be structured, the two central concerns of his teaching. This period also saw the development of Taoism with the figure of Lao Tzu and the text of the Tao Te Ching. Um, as we'll talk about, Lao Tzu has a very different approach to social structure and personal activity than Kongzi. These two alternatives, however, arose in response to widespread distress over conditions in China at the time of the spring and autumn period. I know I've gone over time for this period, but I'm going to go to the next period just because it rounds out this first lecture. The spring and autumn period was followed not by the reestablishment of a peaceful unified kingdom, but by the warring states period. So that was even worse, as you can tell from the name. The warring states period was a period of continued fragmentation of society, ongoing warfare, and instability. And this is widely seen as the reason the philosophies of life developed by Kongzi and Lao Tzu were further developed, were expanded and further disseminated during this period of the warring states, because they continued to have great relevance to the distressful conditions of basically everyone. And here I will introduce just three names: Mengzi, Shunzi, and Chuangzi. Mengzi, otherwise known as Mencius, and Shunzi are the two primary heirs of Kongzi, thus the two major figures in Confucianism or Rushui following Kongzi. They developed radically different ideas of Rushui, and Mengzi became sort of more canonical for Confucianism, but Shunzi was influential through the students of his that developed legalism, which became important for government policy and practice. So they were both from the warring state period. Zhuangzi had a parallel function with respect to Lao Tzu. He is the next towering figure of Taoism. I might also mention that the warring states period, you'll periodically in reading about China hear the phrase the 100 schools of thought. This is the period of the 100 schools of thought. And indeed, there are other figures writing during the warring states period that we'll address later on. I know I said I was going to stop there, but I want to mention that what ends the warring states period is the establishment of the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty, from which we get our name China. Again, in Chinese, it's Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. It's not China. Qin was the first imperial dynasty. It united all of, it extensively united the various warring kingdoms of the warring states period and established the sort of precedent for the Chinese Empire through its various dynasties up until the beginning of the 20th century. It was very short-lived. It only lasted 15 years, but it was enormously influential. So what I'm going to do next time is I'm going to stop the history here and turn to cultural issues, specifically Rushui, Confucianism. And we will return to the history as we move further in our reading, so that by the time we get to the plays, for example, I'll have moved through imperial history up to the UN, because actually it's before that, and we don't even have to go through the. Well, by the time we turn to the poetry book, we'll be going through, for example, the Tang and Sung dynasties. And so I'll have moved through that part of the history for them, and then UN dynasty for the UN drama, and then the more modern history for the 20th movie that we'll be looking at, and the later plays of the modernist plays. Okay, so I'm going to stop there with the history. We'll return to it later, picking up from where we left off with the Qin institution of, or maybe I will say something about the Qin just to give you that introduction to the imperial history. But starting next time, we'll mostly focus on philosophy and culture, and attending particularly to Kongzi. Okay, thanks.